It was a calm afternoon in the city, the kind where people moved slowly and the air felt heavy with heat. The sidewalks were crowded with shoppers carrying bags, kids running ahead of their parents, and street vendors calling out for attention. Among the crowd, a woman walked quietly out of a small clothing store, holding a paper bag with a receipt tucked neatly inside. Her steps were steady, her expression calm, unaware that within a few moments her world was about to turn upside down. Just a few feet behind her, a store clerk hurried out, waving his hands in the air. He looked nervous, almost unsure, but his voice was firm when he pointed toward the woman and said something to two officers standing near their patrol car. The officers turned quickly, their eyes following the direction of his hand. One of them began walking briskly toward the woman, calling out for her to stop. She turned around, a bit surprised, thinking maybe she had dropped something. But the sight of two uniformed officers approaching her with suspicion in their eyes sent a strange chill through her body. "Ma'am, we need to ask you a few questions," one of them said as he stopped in front of her. The other stood slightly to the side, his hand resting on his belt. The woman blinked, trying to understand what was happening. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "The store says you walked out without paying for an item," the officer said, his tone carrying more accusation than inquiry. The woman frowned, opening her bag and pulling out the receipt. "I just paid for everything," she said, holding it out for them to see. "You can check." But the officers didn't take the paper right away. One of them glanced at the store clerk, who nodded uncertainly, as if now he wasn't sure what he had seen. The woman tried to explain further, pointing toward the cashier inside who could confirm her purchase. Still, their expressions didn't soften. One of the officers took a step closer. People around started to slow down, watching. The quiet moment turned into a scene that made the air tense. "Ma'am, please put your bag down," the officer said. His tone left no room for debate. The woman hesitated for a second but complied, placing it gently on the ground. She stood still, her hands visible, not wanting to make any sudden move that could be misunderstood. She knew the importance of staying calm, especially in moments like this. "You can call the store manager," she said softly. "I didn't take anything." But before her words could sink in, one of the officers spoke again. "We just need to check your bag, ma'am. Cooperate and we can clear this up." The officer opened the paper bag, checking inside. It only contained the shirt she had bought, still neatly folded, with the tag and receipt inside. There was nothing suspicious. Yet, instead of apologizing, the officers exchanged a look that said they weren't done. "We're going to need to see some ID," the first one said. The woman reached for her purse slowly, careful to make every move visible. "It's in my wallet," she said, handing it over. The officer took it and looked at her driver's license, not realizing who she was. Her name and position were right there in small print, but it didn't seem to register. "Wait here," he said, walking a few steps away to radio in her name. The second officer stayed close, his posture stiff, watching her like she might run. She didn't. She just stood there quietly, breathing slowly, her heart heavy with a feeling she knew too well. The sting of being doubted for no reason. A few people had stopped nearby now. Some whispered, others lifted their phones to record. The woman could feel their eyes on her, the quiet murmurs about what she might have done. She tried not to meet their gaze. She had seen too many situations like this in her career. She just never imagined she would be the one in the center of it. The officer returned a few minutes later, still holding her ID. "Step over here, ma'am," he said. "We're going to have to take you in until this gets sorted out." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, more in disbelief than anger. "Take me in?" she repeated quietly. "I just showed you proof that I paid. You have the receipt right there." But her calm tone only seemed to irritate him more. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be," he replied, reaching for his cuffs. The woman took a step back instinctively, not in defiance but out of shock. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady but firm. The officer grabbed her wrist gently at first, then with more force when she didn't immediately turn around. The moment his hand closed around her arm, something inside her broke, not from fear but from disappointment. She had trained officers like him. She had taught them to look beyond assumptions, to assess situations fairly, to see people as people. And yet here she was being treated like a suspect in front of strangers. "I said don't resist," the officer warned, his tone sharper now. The other one stepped closer, ready to assist. The woman closed her eyes briefly, trying to keep her composure. "I'm not resisting," she said softly. "I just want you to listen." But they didn't. Within seconds, she felt the cold click of metal around her wrists. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Someone whispered, "That's not right." Another voice said she showed them the receipt. But the officers didn't respond. They guided her toward the patrol car, their hands firm on her arms. The woman walked without struggle, though each step felt heavier than the last. She had seen many arrests in her life, some fair, some unjust, but being on the other side of it was a pain she couldn't quite describe. The humiliation wasn't just about being mistaken. It was about being unseen, about the fact that even her calmness, her words, her evidence weren't enough to be believed. When they reached the car, the officers opened the back door and helped her in. The seat was hard, the air inside still carrying the faint smell of old leather and dust. She looked out through the window as people watched silently. Her reflection stared back at her, strong but tired. She thought about how many times she had spoken to officers about patience, empathy, and awareness. She had always believed those lessons mattered. But in that moment, it felt like they hadn't reached far enough. One of the officers stood outside speaking into his radio. The other leaned on the trunk of the car, glancing occasionally toward her. He seemed uncertain now, like a small part of him was beginning to doubt the decision, but he didn't say anything. The store clerk had already gone back inside, leaving the officers to deal with what they thought was a clear case. Minutes passed, long and slow. The woman sat quietly, her wrists still in cuffs, her eyes watching the world move outside the window. She thought about how differently things might have gone if she had just said who she was from the start. But something inside her refused to. She wanted to see if fairness still existed when the badge wasn't visible. She wanted to know if respect came only with rank. Then a patrol SUV pulled up. A senior sergeant stepped out, his pace brisk. He looked at the scene, the two younger officers, the crowd, the woman in the back seat, and his face shifted from curiosity to alarm. He walked quickly to the car, peering through the window. When his eyes met hers, his breath caught. Recognition hit instantly. "Oh my God," he whispered under his breath. He turned toward the two officers, his tone suddenly sharp. "Get her out of there now." The officers looked confused. "Sir?" one of them asked. "That woman is Captain Johnson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "She's your commanding officer." The color drained from their faces. One officer dropped his radio. The other fumbled with the keys, rushing to unlock the car door. The woman stepped out slowly, her wrists still bound. The sergeant himself removed the cuffs, his hands shaking. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "We didn't know." She rubbed her wrists gently, looking at the two officers who had arrested her. Their expressions were full of regret, but also confusion, as if they had just realized how easily assumptions could ruin someone's dignity. The crowd had gone quiet now, everyone sensing something important had just unfolded. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold or shout. She simply looked at them and said, "This is why training matters." Her tone was calm but firm, carrying the weight of truth. Then she turned and walked away slowly, leaving behind a silence thicker than before, the kind that made people think, really think about what they had just witnessed. As she disappeared into the crowd, the sergeant looked at the two young officers and said quietly, "You just arrested your captain." The younger one swallowed hard, his face pale. "I didn't even look at her ID properly," he murmured. "No," the sergeant said. "You didn't look at her at all." The next morning, the police station buzzed with whispers. Everyone had heard about what happened at the shopping district, but no one dared to speak too loudly. The story had spread quickly. Two young officers had arrested their own captain, not realizing who she was. Some found it unbelievable. Others weren't surprised at all. The captain herself walked through the hallway early that morning, her face calm but her mind heavy. The stares followed her, some filled with sympathy, others with curiosity. She went straight to her office, placed her bag on the desk, and sat down for a long moment before taking a deep breath. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed, not just in the officers, but in the system that allowed assumptions to guide decisions. The incident had reminded her of something she had always known deep down. Respect and fairness could not depend on a uniform. A soft knock came at her door. The sergeant who had arrived at the scene the day before stepped in, looking uneasy. "Ma'am?" he said quietly. Internal Affairs wants to review the report. They're asking for your statement, too. She nodded. That's fine. Tell them I'll come down in an hour. He hesitated for a moment. Ma'am, those two officers, they're scared. They know they made a serious mistake. The captain looked up. Are they here? Yes, ma'am. They're waiting outside. Send them in, she said. The two officers entered the room slowly. Their heads were low, their shoulders tense. The air felt thick with guilt. The younger one looked like he hadn't slept at all. The captain studied them quietly for a few seconds before speaking. Do you know why I'm not furious? She asked. Neither of them answered. Finally, the older one shook his head. Because you understand mistakes happen? He said, his voice small. No, she replied. Because I know this isn't just about you. It's about what we're taught, what we choose to see when we look at someone. You saw a woman. You saw color. You saw what you thought was a situation, but you didn't see a person. You didn't even see her ID. And that scares me more than the handcuffs did. The room stayed silent. One of the officers shifted uneasily. The captain leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but sharp. You didn't ask questions. You assumed. And that's not policing, that's profiling. You need to understand the difference. The younger officer swallowed hard. Ma'am, I'm sorry. We thought we were doing the right thing. I believe you did, she said softly. But doing the right thing starts with thinking before acting. It means seeing everyone as equal until proven otherwise. You forgot that yesterday. Both officers nodded silently. The captain sighed, her tone softening. I don't want your careers ruined over this. But I do want you to learn from it. This department has to change, and that starts with each of us. She dismissed them with a small gesture, and they left quietly, the door closing gently behind them. When they were gone, she leaned back in her chair and stared out the window. The sun was bright outside, but the light didn't feel warm. It felt harsh, like truth often does. Later that day, she sat in the Internal Affairs office. A board of 3 senior officials listened as she recounted every moment of the incident. The misunderstanding, the arrest, and the moment the sergeant arrived. She told it simply, without anger or exaggeration. When she finished, one of them asked, Do you want to press charges or file a complaint? She shook her head. No, I just want this to mean something. I want training to be better. I want our officers to learn how to see beyond assumptions. The officials exchanged glances. One of them wrote a note, then said, We'll open a review on the department's bias and conduct training. The captain nodded. That's all I ask. That evening, she drove home through quiet streets, the radio off, her thoughts loud. She replayed the moment she was handcuffed, the looks on the faces of those watching, the cold click of the cuffs, not out of pain but reflection. She thought about all the young officers she had mentored over the years, how many times she had told them that judgment is a dangerous thing when left unchecked. She wondered how many truly listened. When she got home, she sat on her porch for a long while watching the sunset fade into the night. A neighbor walking by stopped to greet her. Rough day? He asked casually. She smiled faintly. Something like that. You'll handle it, he said. You always do, she nodded. I will. But I think this time it's going to change a few things. The next morning, the story hit the news. Not because she reported it, but because someone had recorded it at the scene. The video spread across social media within hours. The headline read, Cops detain black woman not knowing she's their captain. The footage showed her standing calmly as the officers questioned her, then the moment they placed her in cuffs. It also showed her silence, her patience. The internet exploded with reactions. Some were angry. Some were supportive. Many were shocked. At the station, reporters gathered outside waiting for a statement. The police chief called an emergency meeting. Cameras flashed as journalists shouted questions. Inside the conference room, the captain sat quietly at the end of the long table. The chief spoke first, addressing the issue. He didn't name the officers, but he acknowledged the mistake and promised a full internal review. Then he turned to her. Would you like to say something? He asked. She stood slowly, the room going silent. Her voice was calm but firm. Yesterday was a reminder, not just for our department, but for everyone wearing this badge. We're trained to protect and serve, but that starts with how we see people. No one should be judged by the color of their skin or by someone's assumption. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to make sure we do better. Her words spread quickly. Reporters quoted her speech across television and online platforms. Many praised her composure, her grace. Others questioned how such a thing could still happen within a department led by someone like her. But instead of letting the noise consume her, she focused on change. Over the next week, she held private meetings with her training division. Together, they reviewed the current bias and community programs. She pointed out what was missing: real-life training, emotional awareness, empathy exercises. "We can't fix what we don't acknowledge," she said during one meeting. "We can't talk about respect in theory and fail to show it in practice." The department agreed to launch a new initiative. Officers would attend workshops focused on recognizing unconscious bias and managing confrontations with understanding rather than assumption. The captain insisted on leading the first session herself. When the day came, the room filled with young recruits and experienced officers alike. Some looked nervous, others skeptical. She began by showing the video, the same one that had gone viral. No one spoke. The silence in the room was deep, uncomfortable. She paused the clip at the moment her wrists were being cuffed. "What do you see here?" she asked. A few officers exchanged glances. One finally said, "A misunderstanding." "No," she said gently. "Look again. You see fear. You see pride. You see judgment. And you see a lack of communication. That's what went wrong." She walked around the room slowly as she spoke. "I don't tell you this story to embarrass anyone. I tell it because it's real. It happened to me. And if it can happen to your captain, it can happen to anyone. We have to change how we see people, how we talk to them, how we listen." The room stayed quiet, but her words sank deep. For the first time, many of the officers truly saw her, not just as their superior, but as a person who had lived through the very things she tried to protect others from. When the session ended, several officers approached her privately. Some apologized. Some thanked her for speaking so openly. One of them, a young recruit, said softly, "Ma'am, I want to be the kind of officer who listens first." She smiled and said, "That's a good place to start." That night, as she left the building, she stopped in front of the large plaque at the entrance. It read, "To serve and protect." She traced the words with her fingers and whispered to herself, "We'll make that true again." She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet sense of hope. Hope that maybe what happened wasn't just a mistake, but a beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the story of the captain's arrest continued to ripple through the city. News stations still replayed the video, talk shows discussed it, and social media was filled with opinions. Some praised her calm reaction, calling her an example of true leadership. Others criticized the department, demanding deeper change. Through it all, the captain remained quiet, focusing on her work. She didn't chase attention or try to explain herself. She believed real change didn't come from noise, it came from action. At the precinct, the mood had shifted. Officers walked with more awareness now. Conversations in the hallways were softer, more thoughtful. Even the two young officers who had detained her seemed different. They showed up early, participated in every training, and volunteered for community outreach programs. The captain noticed, and though she didn't say it aloud, she was proud. Mistakes could destroy people, but they could also teach powerful lessons. One morning, she was reviewing reports when her assistant stepped into her office. "Ma'am, the mayor's office called. They want you to attend a community forum next week. It's about police relations and trust." The captain nodded slowly. "I'll be there," she said. When the day came, the auditorium was full. There were city officials, reporters, and a mix of community members, young and old, angry and hopeful. The tension in the room was heavy. People wanted answers. They wanted change. When the captain stepped on stage, the audience grew quiet. She didn't bring notes or a speech. She simply stood at the podium, her posture steady, her eyes meeting the crowd. "A few weeks ago," she began, "some of my own officers made a mistake. They acted on what they assumed instead of what they knew. That mistake hurt me, but it also opened a door. It showed us that no matter how high you climb, you are still human. And being human means we must learn every day." Her voice was soft but carried weight. She spoke about the importance of understanding, of listening to one another, and of breaking down the invisible walls between the police and the public. The crowd listened closely. When she finished, there was silence, then slow, sincere applause. After the event, people approached her. Some wanted to thank her. Others wanted to share their stories of mistrust and fear. She listened to each one patiently, shaking hands, nodding, and offering quiet words of understanding. It wasn't about public image for her. It was about connection, real human connection. Back at the station, she continued to lead by example. The new training programs began to grow, attracting attention from other precincts in the state. She was invited to speak at conferences, to share what her department was doing differently. But deep down, she knew that progress wasn't a headline. It was a daily effort, one that needed patience and consistency. One evening, she stayed late at her desk, going over training reports. The young officer who had first grabbed her arm that day knocked on the door. He looked nervous but determined. "Ma'am, can I talk to you for a minute?" She looked up and gestured for him to come in. "Of course." He sat across from her, fidgeting slightly before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for not ruining my career, for giving me another chance. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how fast I made that call without really seeing you. I guess I never understood what bias looked like until that moment." She nodded slowly. "Awareness is the first step," she said. "It's what you do after that matters more." He smiled a little. "I want to do better. I signed up to mentor at the youth center. I figured maybe if I listen to the people we serve, I'll start to understand them better." The captain's expression softened. "That's a good start. Change begins when we choose to see people as stories, not statistics." As he left, she felt a small sense of peace. Maybe what had happened wasn't just an embarrassing incident. Maybe it was the spark the department needed. Over the next few months, the atmosphere in the city began to shift. The department's relationship with the community started to heal. Officers began attending local events not as enforcers, but as neighbors. They played basketball with kids, joined food drives, and held open conversations about safety and trust. The captain was there for all of it, not to be seen, but to make sure the effort stayed real. One Saturday morning, she visited a neighborhood event in one of the city's older districts. It was a community cleanup project, organized by a group of teenagers. She joined in, wearing plain clothes, helping paint over graffiti and pick up trash. A young girl approached her, maybe 12 or 13, holding a clipboard. "Are you really a police captain?" the girl asked curiously. The captain smiled. "Yes, I am." The girl looked thoughtful. "My brother says cops don't care about people like us." The captain crouched down slightly so they were eye level. "Your brother has every right to feel that way if he's been treated unfairly. But I want to change that. I want to make sure that when you grow up, you see police officers who listen, who protect, and who respect you." The girl studied her for a moment, then smiled shyly. "You seem nice. I think you can do it." The captain laughed softly. "Thank you. I'll try my best." Moments like that gave her strength. They reminded her why she had joined the force in the first place, not for power or authority, but to make a difference, to be part of something that could heal instead of harm. As the weeks went on, the department's efforts started to show results. Complaints dropped, trust surveys improved, and even city officials noticed the difference. The chief called her into his office one afternoon. He looked tired but content. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "You turned a mistake into a movement." The captain shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. Everyone played a part," he smiled. "Maybe so. But leadership starts from the top. You gave people hope." She thanked him quietly and returned to her office. Sitting at her desk, she looked at the framed photo on her shelf. A picture of her graduating from the academy years ago, full of energy and belief in what was possible. She still carried that same belief, though now it was tempered with wisdom. Later that week, a journalist requested to interview her for a national feature on police reform. She hesitated at first, not wanting to turn her story into a spectacle, but eventually agreed. The interview took place in her office, the sun pouring through the window. The reporter asked, "Why didn't you tell the officers who you were that day?" The captain paused, thinking carefully before she answered. "Because I wanted to see what it's like to be treated as just another person. Not as a captain, not as someone in authority, just as me. And what I saw was painful but necessary. It showed me the work we still have to do." The interviewer nodded. "Do you think things are changing?" The captain smiled faintly. "Change isn't instant. It's a slow climb. But yes, I believe we're moving in the right direction, one conversation at a time, one act of understanding at a time." When the article came out, it touched millions. People across the country shared it, calling her story a symbol of strength and grace under pressure. But for her, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about responsibility, to her officers, to her city, and to the idea that justice must always start with humanity. One night, she sat alone in her car outside the station. The parking lot was quiet, the lights casting soft shadows on the pavement. She thought about that day again, the fear, the confusion, the sting of being handcuffed in public. But instead of anger, she felt gratitude. That moment had revealed the cracks that needed fixing. And because of it, she had found new purpose. As she started the engine, she whispered softly, "Sometimes life humbles you to remind you why you started." The road ahead was long, but she wasn't afraid of it. She had faced worse. And now, with every step, she was proving that real leadership wasn't about titles or ranks. It was about compassion, courage, and the willingness to change what needed changing. And though the world would remember her for that one viral moment, she would always remember it as something else entirely. The day she became not just a captain, but a leader who truly understood what it meant to serve. The air around the shopping center felt heavy as the truth began to sink in. The two officers who had placed the woman in handcuffs were now standing in silence, their faces pale and uneasy. They had no idea that the woman they had just detained was not a suspect but their own commanding officer, a captain who had led the department with fairness and strength for years. When the sergeant rushed to the scene, everything stopped for a moment. The crowd that had gathered around the patrol car fell silent, sensing something had shifted. The sergeant looked through the open car door and his heart dropped. He quickly ordered the cuffs removed. One of the officers fumbled with the key, his hands trembling as he tried to unlock them. The captain stepped out slowly, straightening her jacket, her expression calm but firm. The sergeant began to speak, his voice nervous. "Captain, I had no idea. I'm so sorry, ma'am." The captain didn't raise her voice. She looked at him, then at the two younger officers. Her words came out steady and low. "You shouldn't be sorry because of who I am. You should be sorry because of what you did," the crowd murmured, realizing they were witnessing something bigger than a misunderstanding. The officers looked down, too ashamed to meet her eyes. The sergeant started to explain, saying they had received a call about possible shoplifting, but the captain simply nodded, not interrupting. "I understand," she said quietly. "But did you even ask her to show a receipt before assuming guilt?" Neither officer could answer. The captain turned toward the crowd, some of whom were still recording with their phones. She didn't tell them to stop. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked toward her car parked nearby. Before she left, she turned back to the officers. "We'll talk about this at the station," she said firmly. When she drove away, the weight of her words stayed behind. The two officers stood frozen, realizing the mistake they had made could follow them for the rest of their careers. The sergeant ordered them to return to the station immediately. The ride back was silent except for the sound of the police radio crackling every few seconds. At the department, news had already spread. By the time the captain arrived, several officers had heard about the incident. Some were shocked. Others were angry. The chief was waiting in his office, his face serious. He stood when she entered. "I just heard what happened," he said. "Are you all right?" The captain nodded. "I'm fine physically, but this department has a lot to learn." They both sat down. She explained what had happened from her perspective, how she had been detained without a chance to explain, how assumptions had been made instantly, and how the officer's attitude changed only when they realized who she was. The chief listened quietly, occasionally taking notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This is going to be a serious issue," he said. There were cameras. People saw what happened. The captain nodded again. "Good, maybe it's time they did." The chief hesitated. "What do you want to do about the officers?" She paused for a moment. "They need to be held accountable," she said. "But I don't want to ruin their lives. I want them to learn from this. I want the department to learn from this." That night, videos of the incident began circulating online. Within hours, the story spread across social media and news outlets. People were shocked to see a police captain, a woman known for her integrity, treated so poorly by her own team. Some viewers were angry. Others said it was an important lesson about bias and judgment. The department received hundreds of messages and calls demanding an explanation. Inside the station, the captain stayed calm. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't post on social media. Instead, she met with the internal affairs team to review what had happened. The officers involved were temporarily suspended while an investigation took place. Days passed and tension grew. Some officers whispered that the younger cops had made a terrible mistake but didn't mean harm. Others felt it was time to face uncomfortable truths about how easily assumptions could cloud judgment. One morning, the captain walked into the briefing room where most of the department was gathered. The room went silent as she stepped up to the front. She didn't need a microphone. Everyone could feel the weight of her presence. "I know everyone has heard what happened," she began, "and I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here because this moment has something to teach all of us." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting the faces of officers she had trained, worked beside, and respected. "Every day we put on this uniform, we carry responsibility. People trust us to be fair, to think before we act. But sometimes we let our assumptions get in the way of that duty. What happened to me could happen to anyone who looks like me, and that should never be okay." The officers listened quietly, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The two who had detained her were present too, sitting in the back. They looked remorseful, their eyes lowered. "When you saw me that day," she continued, "you didn't see a person. You saw what you expected to see. A suspect, not a citizen, not a leader, and definitely not a captain. That's the problem we have to fix." Her voice stayed calm but strong. "We talk about serving the community, but we can't do that if we treat people based on what they look like. We have to listen before we act, observe before we judge, because one wrong decision doesn't just harm a person, it harms trust. It harms the department. It harms us all." When she finished speaking, the room was completely silent. No one moved for several seconds. Then the chief stood and nodded slowly. "Thank you, Captain. We needed to hear that." After the meeting, some officers approached her privately. One said, "I'm sorry this happened to you, ma'am. It made me think about the times I might have judged too quickly." The captain appreciated the honesty. She didn't hold grudges. Instead, she saw this as a turning point, a chance for real change. She knew this moment, though painful, could become something powerful if handled the right way. In the following weeks, the department began reviewing its training procedures. The captain worked with a team to design new sessions focused on empathy, communication, and community awareness. She insisted that every officer attend, no matter their rank or years of experience. Meanwhile, the public followed the story closely. Many people praised her for the grace she showed during and after the incident. Others criticized the department, calling for reform. Through it all, the captain stayed professional. She gave one short interview saying only, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Behind the scenes, the two officers who detained her requested a meeting. They wanted to apologize in person. The captain agreed. When they sat across from her in the small office, they both looked nervous. One of them spoke first. "We're sorry, ma'am. We should have listened. We acted on assumption, and that's on us." The captain nodded slowly. "I accept your apology. But remember, next time it might not be me. It might be someone who doesn't have a badge to protect them. Think about that before you act." They both nodded, clearly moved by her words. It wasn't just forgiveness, it was a lesson they would never forget. Months later, the department began to change. The training programs brought new energy into the workplace. Officers started having open discussions about how to handle tense situations better. The captain often sat in the back of the room during those sessions, quietly observing, proud of the progress being made. Though the incident had started as a painful experience, it became a symbol of accountability and growth. The captain had turned a moment of disrespect into a movement for change. Her quiet strength spoke louder than anger ever could. By the end of the year, community members began noticing the difference. More people said they felt safer talking to officers. The department received recognition from the city for improving public trust. And the captain, despite everything, continued her work with the same steady grace she always had. The day she was detained could have left her bitter. But instead, she used it to open eyes, change hearts, and rebuild trust. What began as a mistake ended up as a turning point. Not just for 2 officers, but for an entire department that finally learned what true leadership looked like. Months passed since that unforgettable day outside the store, yet the memory remained vivid in everyone's mind. For the captain, it was not just an incident, it was a lesson that reshaped her view of leadership. The department had come a long way since then, but she knew there was still more work to do. Change didn't happen overnight, and real understanding took time. Every morning she arrived at the station early, greeting the officers as they came in. There was a new atmosphere now, calmer, more respectful. The 2 young officers who had once detained her were still with the department, though they carried themselves differently these days. They were quieter, more thoughtful, and often volunteered for community events, hoping to show people that they were learning and growing. One morning, the captain stood near the coffee machine as the same 2 officers approached. They looked uncertain but smiled politely. "Good morning, Captain," one of them said. She smiled back. "Morning. How's the new community project going?" "It's good," the other replied. "We've been talking to local business owners, setting up safety workshops. People seem more willing to talk to us now." The captain nodded approvingly. "That's what matters. Keep listening. Keep showing them you care." After they left, she took a moment to think about how far things had come. The department that once struggled with trust had started to rebuild it piece by piece. And though her experience had been painful, she knew it had sparked something necessary. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a city event honoring public service. When her name was called, the room filled with applause. She walked up to the podium, her posture straight, but her smile soft. Looking out at the audience, officers, city leaders, and residents, she began to speak in her steady, calm voice. "Sometimes," she said, "the hardest lessons come from the most unexpected moments. What happened to me wasn't easy, but it showed me that leadership isn't about rank. It's about responsibility. It's about how we treat people when no one's watching." She paused, letting her words sink in. "When that incident happened, I could have stayed silent. I could have been angry. But instead, I wanted to understand why it happened. And I realized something important. It's not just about policy or procedure. It's about people, about hearts and minds." The audience listened closely. "We all make mistakes," she continued, "but what defines us is how we respond to them. We can't build trust by pretending we're perfect. We build it by admitting when we're wrong and doing better next time." After the event, several people approached her to thank her for her honesty. A few young recruits said her story had inspired them to join the force with a different mindset, to protect, not to judge. Back at the station, her work continued. She began organizing monthly meetings between officers and community members. These gatherings were simple: coffee, open discussions, honest questions. At first, some officers were hesitant, unsure of how people would respond. But soon, they began to see the value of listening instead of talking. One evening during one of these meetings, an elderly woman stood up. She looked directly at the captain and said, "I was there that day outside the store. I saw how you handled it. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't fight back. You showed strength without anger. I want to thank you for that." The room grew quiet. The captain smiled softly and replied, "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot. I believe calm can be more powerful than rage." After that meeting, more people began showing up. The conversations grew deeper. Officers started hearing personal stories about fear, misunderstanding, and the need for compassion. These talks didn't just heal the community, they helped heal the department too. As time went on, the captain began to notice how her story had spread far beyond their city. News outlets and organizations from other states reached out to ask her to speak about leadership, fairness, and respect. She wasn't interested in fame or praise. She simply wanted her experience to make a difference. During one of her speeches, at a national law enforcement conference, she shared something she had never told anyone publicly before. "When I sat in that patrol car, handcuffed, I thought about all the people who never got the chance to explain themselves. I thought about how many times silence has been mistaken for guilt. And I promised myself that if I ever got out of that situation, I'd do something to make sure others wouldn't have to live through it. Her words moved the audience. Some officers stood to applaud, others had tears in their eyes. She ended her talk by saying, "We wear these badges to protect, not to intimidate. Let's remember that every single time we step out in uniform."